There are quite a number of exploitation techniques for SQL injection attacks. Let's go over the 5 most common ones, which are important to know for your exam. The first one is easiest, and it's called the union-based exploitation technique. What you try to do is select information from another table or another column and union that with the selection of the original SQL statement. You join the results together, so to speak. The next exploitation technique is called the error-based exploitation technique. And what you try to do here is try to force an error, for instance a syntax error, thereby hoping that the database will show up useful information in its error output. Often error messages aren't handled gracefully by the application, but are shown directly to the end user. And that can be very helpful if you're an attacker. Another exploitation technique is the Boolean exploitation technique. Hereby you often try to do a comparison, for instance a character or string comparison. You use for instance the SQL method sleep or delay to see whether the Boolean statement was true or false. The Boolean exploitation technique is usually much more complex, but it can be very useful sometimes. And speaking of complex exploitation techniques, you also have the out-of-band exploitation technique. As shown previously with the 3 different channels, the out-of-band exploitation technique uses a side channel in order to extract or exfiltrate information. That also means you need to have control over some kind of side channel so you can see whether the SQL statement worked or not. The 5th exploitation technique, which is important to know for your exam, is the tautology exploitation technique. A tautology is a statement that is always true. And by using the tautology exploitation technique, you for instance can modify the logic of a SQL statement, or you can retrieve a specific result set. Let's go over these exploitation techniques by using a number of examples. At the left-hand side you see the payload, so the value that an attacker sends to the web application. The payload hi is considered a valid string. So the underlying SQL statement executes normally and will return a result based on the SQL statement. Now what if instead of hi I would use hi with a single quote and a double quote? Why would I do that as an attacker? Well, I try to generate an error because I'm using control characters. So this is an example of using an error-based exploitation technique. The next one, single quote or 1 equals 1, we saw already earlier in a previous clip. We try to modify the logic of the select statement. Because 1 equals 1 is always true, this is an example of a tautology. This exploitation technique is often used with login forms, where you try to log in without knowing the exact password or even the username. The next exploitation technique is often used when you try to exfiltrate data. You try to select as much data from the database as possible. Here we try to select the name column from the users table. This is an example of a union-based exploitation technique. The next example looks a bit more complex. Here we compare the leftmost character of the version string with the number 1. This is an example of a Boolean-based exploitation technique. We only expect a result, or a true, when the statement is true. Now if we combine this with a sleep statement, we can see whether the statement was true or not. The last payload is the most complex one and depends on the underlying database engine. This will not work on all platforms. Here we try to enforce a domain name lookup. We use the version string, so if we now have control over the a.com domain and we run that name server, we can see what kind of lookup is being performed. This is an example of an out-of-band exploitation technique. But once again, this is not standard SQL syntax. Hopefully these examples make it easier to understand the different exploitation techniques that you can use. In the next clip, we're going to take a look at how to perform SQL injection attack.